Everyone. My name is Erica George. I'm the Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law, and it is my honor to direct the Tanner Humanities Center. Today, I'm especially honored to welcome our guest, who I don't see on Zoom yet from the Tanner room. But once we are able to see him, we are going to enjoy a presentation from Professor James Campbell, who is the Edgar E. Robinson Professor in United States History at Stanford University. His research focuses on African American history and the wider context of the Black Atlantic. He is particularly interested in the long history of interconnections between Africa and America. One moment. Oh, there you are. Hi. Okay. So he is particularly interested in the long history of interconnections and the exchange between Africa and America, a history that began in the earliest days of the transatlantic slave trade. And he continues to examine the legacies of that in our own time. In recent years, his research has moved in the direction of so-called public history, and he's been intrigued by the ways that societies tell stories about their past, not only in the textbooks and the academic monographs, but also in historical sites, museums, memorials, movements, political movements, and memories, which this present paper deals with. This is part of a larger work. Jim has been with us all year, and he's been one of our most gracious and generous contributors to conversations and our workshops and our work in progress series. When I read this paper, I was really struck by the examination of why do we remember some things like the murder of 3 activists in Mississippi, but not others, like the staging of a Broadway play by James Baldwin, or think of certain people as human rights and civil rights activists and others aren't remembered as such. I'll stop here to let him say more. The paper is called Alternatively Blues for Mr. Charlie, and a different title that I noticed on your slides. But Jim, thank you, welcome, and thank you so much for being a part of our community this year.
Thank you for having me. And Katie's waiting in the wings for when I mess up all of these things. I'm not sure which one there is. Looks like there's 2 different versions.
Okay, I think if you go to that
the
corner there, one more over, yeah, where you got, there you go, perfect.
And I'm going to try to tell it to play from the start.
All right, and is our custom, if you are in the Zoom room, we are asking that you please mute yourself and hide screen. Thank you. Oh, you had it. I'm going to stop this.
Start from the beginning.
Okay, from the beginning, and then we have to duplicate screen for everyone. I don't know why. That's okay. I'll just backtrack. Hold on, I'll just go back. Don't look at the slides real quick. Okay.
We see it. It's good.
And we have to duplicate screens, do we?
We're good.
Looks good from the Zoom room.
Okay, good. And let's just see if it works. It does work. Okay, thank you so much for having me. And I'm going to just put so I can see myself, just so I don't wander off. So I just have to say thank you for, this has been a really wonderful year, notwithstanding the kind of perplexities of the pandemic. So thank you to everybody. Thank you to my fellow fellows, and thank you particularly to the wonderful staff of the Tanner Humanities Center, to Erica, to Jeremy, to Katie, to Susan, to Beth. You have really made this a home for us. And for those of you who are watching or who are not here, if you can ever get a fellowship at the Tanner Center, you really should. It's just been a wonderfully collegial environment, and it's been wonderful to not only hear about other people's work, but also to see what happens when people who come at topics in the humanities from different disciplines, from study of rhetoric or from philosophy, and when we talk together, it's been quite magical. I'm going to talk today little bits and pieces from a current book project, which is set in this corner of the map. That is Neshoba County, Mississippi, and it is, notwithstanding its apparent centrality in the state, this is deep Mississippi. In some ways, I think Neshoba County is to Mississippi what Mississippi is to the United States. It is also the county seat is a town called Philadelphia, Mississippi. You've probably heard of it. You probably know one thing about it. because in 1964, it was the site of one of the most notorious crimes of the civil rights era, the murder of 3 civil rights workers, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, by a group of Klansmen. Arrested on a trumped-up speeding charge by a deputy sheriff who was himself a Klansman. The 3 were held in the Philadelphia Neshoba County Jail while Klansmen in the 2 counties around put in motion a prearranged extermination plan. They were apprehended again that night on their drive home between Philadelphia and Meridian, Mississippi, taken to a remote dirt road, shot. Their bodies were buried in an earthen dam from which they were finally retrieved after a 44-day search. This was their car that they drove, which was found a couple of days early, a couple of days after their disappearance. This is an FBI photo of the excavation at the earthen dam where they were finally recovered. Goodman, Schwerner, and Chaney were not the first people killed during the violent death throes of Mississippi Jim Crow. They would not be the last. But their disappearance galvanized the nation in ways that other murders committed in the era did not. Partly this had to do with the fact that 2 of the victims were white New Yorkers. Partly it had to do with the conduct of local people who contrived to live down to every conceivable stereotype of Southern recalcitrance and bigotry. This is a photo actually of the defendants in the very first hearing after their, in which what should have been a kind of straightforward hearing to see if there was a basis for holding them or bringing charges. The judge in that case dismissed the charges. It would ultimately take the better part of 3 years in a Supreme Court decision for the prosecution of the murderers to take place. And it only happened in federal court. The state of Mississippi never brought charges. So they were ultimately prosecuted for violation of the civil rights of the 3 men that they had killed. Of the, I think, 17 defendants, like 7 of them spent time in jail. The maximum was about 6 years. But this is a photo taken during the hearing that appeared in Life magazine. We talk a lot about photos today, and this is really one of the iconic ones. Cecil Price, the deputy sheriff, Lawrence Rainey, the sheriff, with his Redman tobacco. Redman actually was so pleased by this image that they actually sent him a crate of chewing tobacco. Other Klansmen in the back yucking it up as the charges are dismissed. Again, this crime galvanized the nation. Walter Cronkite reported nightly on the search from bloody Neshoba. Lyndon Johnson dispatched nearly 200 FBI agents to investigate the case. People wrote poems and composed folk songs and painted paintings, including this one, Murder in Mississippi, by Norman Rockwell. The same Norman Rockwell whose homely magazine covers for the Saturday Evening Post had so long beguiled Americans with a reassuring image of themselves. This fascination has continued to the present almost 60 years later. The Neshoba murders are the subject of literally scores, probably hundreds of books, literally thousands of newspaper articles, and no fewer than 4 Hollywood movies, including the Academy Award nominated Mississippi Burning. I've spent much of the last 20 years working on this case. Actually, I said in my talk to the fellows the other day, how this iconic FBI image had become like a kind of medieval triptych. And when I was looking for images on the web the other day for this PowerPoint, somebody else shared my point of view. Anyway, I have spent much of the last 20 years working on and off on the Neshoba case. Not so much on the murders per se, but on the cluster of stories that have gathered in their wake. Rather than adding another leaf to the existing literature, my intention is to try to use this episode to reflect on the nature of historical memory itself, at both an individual and a collective level. What stories do different people remember? What do they forget? How do different people recount shared experiences? And how do those recountings change over time? What does the very act of narration do to the substance of what we remember? How and why do some stories become canonical, part of our shared patrimony as Americans, while others are lost to time? Who gets to decide? In other words, what are the politics of historical memory? To write this book, I have consulted a diverse range of archives, including newspapers and magazines, government documents, including the FBI files, the Myburn files. In fact, that's the title of the movie. The FBI file in this case was called Myburn, Mississippi Burning. It was actually opened a couple days before the murders, following the burning of a church in Neshoba County, which was in fact what drew the 3 civil rights workers to come into the county on the day of their murder. I've used visual materials, including photographs. You're going to see a lot of them today, private correspondence, and so forth. But most of my research comes from oral histories. I frankly am a little reluctant to dignify what I've been doing with that term. Suppose a more honest way to characterize my methodology, insofar as I have one, is that I talk to people and listen to their stories. I would have to go back to my notes to tell you exactly how many such conversations I have conducted, certainly more than 1,000, with something between 200 and 300 different people, including family members of the slain men, civil rights movement veterans, journalists who covered the story, filmmakers, and ordinary Neshobans, white and black, whose lives were in some ways touched by the events of that bloody summer. In my lighter moments, I think of calling the book Philadelphia Stories, a title too clever by half, but one that captures something of my purpose. I've been writing in earnest for about 1.5 years now. I have quite a few chapters completed, one of which I presented earlier this week to my fellow fellows, a strange and frankly experimental chapter that focuses on James Baldwin, or more properly, on Baldwin's short-lived 1964 Broadway play, Blues for Mr. Charlie. And here you see the playbill, as well as a photograph from the production. The basic object of that chapter was to use the play's 100-day run, a flop by Broadway standards, to bring into the same analytical space events that were happening simultaneously, but that are usually discussed separately by historians, including not only events related to the civil rights story, the burning of Mount Zion Church, the murders, Lyndon Johnson's signing of the Declaration of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 a few days later, but also other events as well, including the 1964 Harlem riot, the first of a series of so-called riots or ghetto uprisings that summer, the first of America's so-called 1960s long hot summers, which erupted in the middle of the 44-day search for the bodies, and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which occurred or may have occurred on the day that the bodies were recovered. I got some wonderful feedback from my colleagues about that chapter, some of it encouraging, some of it challenging, all of it constructive and helpful. One of the suggestions was that the stories I was telling in the chapter would be a lot richer if there were pictures, a comment with which I emphatically agree, and which, as is already apparent from the 20 or so images I have already shown you, I have tried to take to heart in this talk. Different historical events leave different deposits in our collective memory box. But one would be hard-pressed to imagine any historical period or episode that left a richer photographic archive than the civil rights movement. A photographic archive, I might add, that is chiefly in black and white, a medium that in a more than metaphorical way offered the perfect medium for recording the Black freedom struggle. And I'll just take this photo. I'm going to riff on a few photos today. This is actually a few days after the bodies were recovered. That's, some of you will recognize, that's Bob Moses, the chief field secretary of SNCC the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and one of the chief organizers of the 1964 Mississippi Summer Project. I actually have interviewed 3 of the people in this photo. That's little Ben Chaney, 11 years old, the younger brother of James Chaney, one of the murdered men. To his left is a man named Clinton Collier, a local activist that I'm sure none of you have ever heard of. If you're ever going to build a statue to a civil rights person, it should probably be of Clinton Collier. This photograph was taken as part of one of the branches of the Freedom Summer, was called the Southern Documentary Project, a group of photographers who came down to document the movement. I've actually mostly tried not to think about what poor publisher I'm going to try to saddle this book with. But if I have any choice in the matter, I can promise you that I will opt for the one that allows me to use the most photographs, which also provides an introduction of sorts to what I want to do today. Rather than rehearse a paper that many of you have already just read, I thought what I would do is show you some more pictures. Or not just show you pictures, but try to use a selection of images to introduce not only the Baldwin chapter, but some of the other chapters that I've been writing, to share some of the stories that I've been trying to tell and reflect upon. If time permits, I also hope to read some short excerpts from a few of those chapters. And I know it's a bit obnoxious to read to people in a setting like this. So if you get tired of my drone, at least you can enjoy looking at the pictures. 3 of the chapters are about surviving family members of the murdered men. This is Carolyn Goodman, mother of Andrew Goodman, who I think it is fair to say found a reason to live following her son's death by living her life as a memorial to him. Carolyn died in 2006. Shows you how long I've been working on this, that I got to know her and spent a great deal of time with her before she passed. That's the woman I remember. Here's another iconic civil rights image. This is her and her husband, Robert, at Newark Airport as the body of their son was unloaded from the belly of the plane. This is Rita Schwerner, the widow of Mickey Schwerner. I think she was 21 at the time. Rita, now a lawyer, decided for reasons that I tried to discuss to take a very different course from the one followed by Carolyn Goodman, deliberately not to live her life as a memorial to her slain husband. And this is young Ben Chaney, who I already mentioned, James Chaney's 11-year-old brother, who tracked perhaps the most tragic course of all. And this is a harrowing chapter. One of the things that happened, I mean, again, the differences in experience of the 3 murdered men, while the Schwerners and Goodman family in the kind of left New York circles in which they traveled acquired a certain kind of exalted status. I mean, utterly unwelcome, but exalted. The Cheneys still lived in Mississippi, where their house was shot up occasionally in drive-by shootings and firebombed. Fannie Lee Chaney was fired from her job at the local bakery the day after her son's disappearance. In a move that was explicable, though ultimately tragic, Carolyn Goodman contrived the idea of saving Ben by moving him out of Meridian, Mississippi, and enrolling him in New York's Walden School, an independent school on Central Park West in New York's Upper West Side, as the first recipient of the Andrew Goodman Memorial Scholarship. And things went badly from there. Here's a few other images of Ben, just an incredibly sweet boy. This is him at his brother's funeral as the casket was being lowered. Some of these photographs, including this one, were taken by a Life magazine photographer named Bill Epridge. This one did not run in Life magazine, but it is the one he remembered This is the Cheney family driving away from the funeral. All of them, the three sisters, the mother and father, who were estranged, staring straight forward, and young Ben looking into and through the camera. And what Epridge remembered was he looked at him and he said, "I'll kill them. I'm going to kill them. I'm going to kill them." And he did. In New York, he became involved in the Black Power movement, ultimately the Black Liberation Army. He would eventually spend 13 years in prison for his role in a killing spree that left 4 white people dead. And this also photograph, this was a spread in Life magazine, 2 photos by Bill Epridge juxtaposing Ben Cheney at 11 and Ben Cheney at 17. I have other chapters too. I have a weird chapter called The Five Who Survived, a kind of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern retelling of the murders through the lives of 5 summer volunteers who attended with Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney the orientation for summer volunteers in Oxford, Ohio, in the days before the murders, and then who on June 20th, a day before the murders, 5 of them drove from Oxford, Ohio to Meridian, Mississippi. The next morning, it was a Saturday night when they arrived. The next morning, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney drove up to Philadelphia to their fate, leaving 5 young people, 19 and 20 years old, who at that time had been in Mississippi for less than 24 hours, in the center of one of the epical events of the entire civil rights era. Now, I also have a bunch of chapters about local people, including one about this woman. Her name is Jewel McDonald. I'm sorry, this is not a good photo. Selfies have never been one of my strong points. She was a member of Mount Zion Church, the burned church that Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney had gone to visit. In fact, her mother and brother were beaten by Klansmen on the night they burned the church. If we have some time, I can tell you a story about that night. This is another local woman who I mentioned in our conversation with the fellows earlier this week. Her name is Florence Mars, a 4th generation Neshoban born of a prominent mercantile family. Mars, depending on your point of view, earned either great honor or great notoriety in the aftermath of the murder by becoming one of the only white people in the whole community willing to speak out publicly against the murders and to denounce the Klan, as well as the conspiracy of silence that had engulfed her hometown. And she suffered for that conduct, not in the ways that Black people involved in the movement suffered, but she did receive death threats. She was forced to sell her business after a Klan orchestrated boycott. She was fired from her job as a Sunday school by others in Philadelphia's First Methodist Church, who were afraid that their children might be contaminated by her heterodox views, including her view that murder was wrong. As I mentioned in our conversation the other day, in one of my interviews with Florence, I asked her, why could you see what other people couldn't see? And perhaps because of the way I asked the question, she said, because I was a photographer. I didn't really know what she meant, but she told me that in 1954, after the Brown v. Board of Education decision, she said, I saw white Mississippians lose their minds. And I realized that this Black and white rural world I had grown up in was going to change utterly. So she bought herself a camera. She built a homemade darkroom in an upstairs hallway, and she began to take pictures of Neshoba County, Black and white life, thousands of pictures, none of which she ever sold or exhibited or shared. But she gave them to me to do with what I wanted. So I and a colleague at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History published this book. I don't normally plug books, but this particular book, all royalties go to support the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. So please buy it. It makes a wonderful stocking stuffer, and it is a gorgeous book. I won't read you what I've written about Florence. There is an essay in this book, but I thought I'd share some of her photos with you just because they're awesome. You know, it's so funny when she told me about these photos, I didn't even, she told me that they were sitting in an uncatalogued collection at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History in Jackson. I'd like to say I ran there to see them, but I didn't. What I imagined was a shoebox full of a bunch of snapshots, like what you'd find in my house. It was a couple years later, it was in fact after she died, that I had a student who was going to Mississippi to do research. And I said, hey, while you're down there, would you just see if they can find this collection and have a look at the photos and tell me if they're interested? And then he came back with his eyes as big as saucers and said, you need to go down there. And one of the other things about such a remote place, and so with so little in or out migration, one of the things I was able to do was to actually take these photos to people who I know in Neshoba County and identify them. Amazing, aren't they? That's a photo that tells you something about the complexities of racial etiquette in rural Mississippi, doesn't it? And I love this pair of photos. One of the things that she would do as she was learning her craft is she would go and a lot of the photographs she took were just on the square in town or on Saturdays as people came in from the countryside to shop, as they do in most kind of country towns in Mississippi at the time. They would gather, Black people in this little vacant lot had a fish fry that they would go to, and for a nickel buy fish sandwiches with ketchup that a woman fried in her cast iron pot. And so Mars would go there, take photos, print them at home, and then return the next week and give people copies of these photos. There's a woman named Dora Catenhead, who was a founder of Mount Zion Church. And here you see the photograph, and then you see her looking at that photograph. I know that woman. And so one of the things that I did that I thought would be I blew this picture up and I framed it and I gave it to her. And she said, thank you, but I have that photo on my wall. And I realized that's the photo that she still had. I also have a chapter about these two men, Dick Mulpus and Turner Catlett, native-born Philadelphians whose stories I try to interweave with Harper Lee's beloved novel, To Kill a Mockingbird, and its far less beloved quasi-sequel, Go Set a Watchman. And in fact, I try to read these two Philadelphians as real-life Jem Finches. Second cousins once removed, born half a century apart, Mulpus and Catlett were prototypical decent folk, products of the knot of intermarried families who owned the mercantiles on Philadelphia's Courthouse Square and occupied the cabins on Founders Square at the Neshoba County Fairgrounds. Like Harper Lee's Jem Finch, they saw their warm cocoon of a hometown splintered by a terrible crime. Mulpus was 14 when the murders and their ugly aftermath ended his childhood. Catlett was 63 and living in New York, where he worked, believe it or not, as the executive editor of the New York Times. Catlett, I might add, is living proof of Mark Twain's adage that the difference between history and fiction is that fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities. If you were writing a novel about the Neshoba murders, an event that locked the citizens of Philadelphia, Mississippi, and New York City into a mutually uncomprehending embrace, you would not begin by casting a homespun Philadelphia as editor of the New York Times because nobody would believe it. Stuff like that can only happen in real life. I could go on, but I told you I was going to read some excerpts from the book, so let me try to do that. The following comes from a chapter, and I have no idea where any of these chapters are going to go in relationship to one another, in which I discuss my first visit to Philadelphia, Mississippi, nearly 20 years ago, when I chanced to meet this man, Stanley Dearman, also a journalist, and a man who would become one of the most cherished friends I have ever had in my life. It's kind of a long story, but on that first visit, I wandered into the office of the local Chamber of Commerce and asked the woman at the counter if there was any place that I could visit related to the 1964 murders. I was clearly not the first person who had asked her that question. She kind of rolled her eyes, told me no, and suggested that I should call Stanley Dearman. So I found a phone booth with an actual phone book in it. Like I said, I've been at this a while, and I rang him. He invited me out to the house. Suffice to say that neither the men nor the house were what I expected, as this photograph suggests. Dearman covered the murders in 1964 as a cub reporter for the Meridian Star. He, in fact, took this photograph of Martin Luther King's visit a few days after the burning of the church and the disappearance of the three men. Here you see Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy. The man whose hand they're shaking was a man named Bud Cole, one of the men who was beaten and indeed nearly crippled for life by the Klansmen on the night that they burned the church. Bud Cole was actually Dora Catenhead's son and father of the grandchild who I showed you in the earlier picture. Stanley also covered this. It is worth noting that in 1980, after accepting the Republican nomination, Ronald Reagan kicked off his fall campaign for the presidency by going to the Neshoba County Fair, speaking to a virtually all-white audience. And contrary to some claims by conservative columnist David Brooks, he did indeed have the transcript express his support for states' rights, telling the assembled that you did not need the federal government to accomplish all the things that you accomplished here. He also made a joke about welfare queens and their Cadillacs. Fairground is about 3 miles as the crow flies from the earthen dam where the three men were buried. This is also a photograph. And Dearman, the case haunted him. He said to me on several occasions, he said it to anyone who asked him, there hasn't been a day of my life that I haven't thought about those three men. Shortly after the murders, he purchased the Neshoba Democrat, the newspaper in Philadelphia, which he edited and owned for the next 30 years, spending much of that time working in a very quiet and patient way, not only to encourage his fellow townsfolk to confront what had happened in their community, but also to pressure the state of Mississippi to reopen the case and prosecute the killers, which it finally did in 2005. In fact, on June 21st, 2005, 41 years to the day after the murders, a Clan Kleagle and Jackleg Baptist preacher named Edgar Ray Killen was convicted for his role in orchestrating the murders. And this is, I was in that courtroom, this is Stanley shaking hands with Rita Bender, Rita Schwerner, Mickey Schwerner's widow, following the verdict. So I'm going to read you a little bit from the beginning of that chapter. Reflecting back on his experience in Neshoba County, Joe Sullivan, the FBI major case investigator who oversaw the search for the missing men, marveled at how closed-mouthed local people were. Neshoba County did not need a Klan, he once remarked, since the residents themselves were the most conspiratorial people I ever ran across. They were just naturals. Sullivan was far from alone in his frustration. Over the course of the 20th century, a train of newspaper editors and would-be reformers lamented Neshoban's clannishness, their refusal to cooperate with local law enforcement, their silent acquiescence to criminal activity, from graft and bootlegging to outright murder. Had Sullivan dug a bit deeper in FBI files, he might have unearthed the tale of Neshoba County's own Charlie Chapman, who in the age of John Dillinger, Ma Barker, and Bonnie and Clyde rose to the ranks of public enemy number one. Born a few miles outside of Philadelphia to a respected local family, Chapman was a successful road contractor until the Great Depression ruined him. Unable to settle his debts with his local bank, he robbed it instead, inaugurating a decade-long crime spree stretching from Florida to Texas, highlighted by multiple counts of bank robbery, auto theft, kidnapping, and murder. Thrice arrested, he was thrice convicted, only to escape from prison each time. What is perhaps most remarkable about this story is the fact that Chapman spent most of his time on the lam, living openly in Neshoba County, shopping in local stores, drinking coffee on the courthouse square, and even for a time, driving a school bus, all while operating several profitable rackets. Locals knew perfectly well who he was. None felt compelled to report his whereabouts. Chapman lived in Neshoba County through the late 1930s and into the early 1940s, largely unmolested, notwithstanding at least one shootout with local police and a spectacular 1939 murder, in which a member of his gang shot a rival roadhouse operator in a dispute over vending machine revenues. Parens, the killer, Grady White, had the dubious distinction of becoming the first white man executed in Mississippi's portable electric chair, Old Sparky, which was trucked from Jackson to Philadelphia for the occasion. But when Chapman shot a Meridian police officer in 1942, authorities decided they had had enough. Rather than arrest him, they organized a killing party. Alerted to his movements, a party of 18 men, including state highway patrolmen, sheriff's officers from 3 counties, and at least one local agent of the FBI, set an ambush on a back road between Philadelphia and Meridian. When Chapman appeared, they tripped the floodlights and sprayed him with bullets, thus closing the file on the nation's public enemy number 1. I first heard the story of Charlie Chapman from Stanley Dearman. Dearman had good reason to remember it. His father, a public official in Lauderdale County, had been invited to join the killing party. The elder Dearman declined the offer, but went afterwards to the morgue, where the triumphant officers were parceling out souvenirs from the scene. For some reason, he brought 9-year-old Stanley with him. 75 years later, Dearman still vividly remembered the experience, not least because of the arrival of the most beautiful woman his young eyes had ever beheld, Chapman's gunmo, who showed up to identify the body in full makeup in a ravishing green dress. It was a boy's first intimation of sex, but Dearman also remembered the episode because of what it taught him about the community in which he lived. Its penchant for conspiracy and propensity for violence, its taste for summary justice, and its extraordinary ability not to see. Those lessons would serve him well later in life, as he sought to make sense of another killing party on the road between Philadelphia and Meridian 22 years later. I thought I would also share with you a couple of excerpts, and I should look at the time because you're going to need a shepherd's crook to pull me away from here. We've got a little bit of time. A couple of excerpts that relate to this man. Some of you will have read one of these if I get to it. Person I've also come to cherish, his name is Dave Dennis. He was the chief field secretary for Corps in Mississippi, and with Bob Moses, one of the 2 main organizers of the 1964 Summer Project. And here you see him as a young activist in Mississippi, and then you see him today. Dennis was born on a plant, so again, I'm going to just read a bit. Dennis was born on a plantation in a no-horse town called Omega, wedged in the northeast corner of Louisiana, hard against the Mississippi River. He scarcely knew his father. I only saw my father 5 times in my life, he once told me. The 5th time he was dead. As a child, he moved with his mother from plantation to plantation, living in sharecropper cabins without water or electricity. What he knew of modern conveniences, he learned in the Shreveport Shriners Hospital, where he spent more than a year recovering from a spinal injury that had left him temporarily paralyzed. I didn't want to leave, he recalled with a laugh. You had lights, running water, this box that showed pictures. It was a fabulous place to be. Thus rendered, it seems, a bleak childhood, but Dennis was quick to dispel the notion. Being raised by a single mother, and a lot of these are quotations, and I'll spare you saying quote and unquote. Being raised by a single mother wasn't a strike against you in the Black community, nor was being poor. Neighbors shared food and minded one another's children. Shopkeepers extended credit, knowing that some debts would never be paid. The Black community looked after its own, he said simply. It is tempting to write off such recollections as nostalgia, romancing Jim Crow, as one critic has put it. But Dennis was and is no romantic. Few people were offered such a privileged glimpse into the violence, cruelty, and sheer stupidity of the South's segregated order. But Jim Crow was also a crucible, which forged vital qualities in Southern Black people. Qualities like resourcefulness, resiliency, discretion, and mutual concern. For Dennis, it was these qualities embodied in ordinary, uncelebrated people, sharecroppers and shopkeepers, school teachers and midwives, bootleggers and brothel owners, that created and sustained the civil rights movement. And to get a bit ahead of the story, it was the failure to conserve those qualities, to carry the hard-won resources of the segregated Black community into the ostensibly integrated order that followed, that constituted for Dennis the movement's greatest failure of imagination. Dennis's mother was an enterprising woman, making ends meet as a sharecropper, cook, later as a beautician, cutting hair, using her kitchen as a salon. But it was his maternal grandmother, known to all as Miss Bessie, who provided his first lessons in politics. Fair-skinned, with red hair and green eyes, she carried the legacy of slavery in her countenance. But she was also independent, proud, and in the words of her grandson, a little bit crazy. She'd sit up in front of the bus, he remembered, something that he, even as a small child, knew never to do. Once, after he had taken his customary seat near the back of the bus, she called him to join her in front. Petrified, he refused. Upon disembarking, she slapped him across the face. Partly, he said, for disobeying, but also because I had a right to be there. In a foreword to a book written by his movement comrades Bob Moses and Charlie Cobb, Dennis tells another story of his grandmother, which captures at once the casual cruelty of Jim Crow and the character of the popular movement that would overthrow it. He was living in town by then in a house built by his grandfather. Unlike Shreveport's white neighborhoods, the area had neither electricity nor sewerage. Miss Bessie went to City Hall to demand them. City officials promised to oblige, but only if residents dug the post holes and ditches themselves. Returning home, she set the community to the task. And now this is all from Dennis's foreword. So after working all day, the men came home and then had some more digging. My grandmother organized the women to feed the men. It took months. When it was finished, the city came out and inspected it, then said the ditch and post holes were on the wrong side of the road. Do them over if you want the sewer line and electricity, they said. The men gave up, quit. Every morning after that, my grandmother dragged the chair to the side of the road, sat in it, and sang. Day after day, she did that. Kids teased her. Neighbors shook their head and said she'd gone crazy. But then one day, Mr. Jack from across the street stopped in front of her and said, "If I start digging, will you stop sitting here singing?" She said, yes. He started digging. Others rejoined the effort and the work was done. Miss Bessie returned to City Hall, this time with the whole neighborhood. The city installed the sewers and power lines. It's an amazing story, man. There's other stuff I go on. I guess I have time only for one more. Let me think about which to do. I talk about Dennis's childhood, his initial reluctance. He tells a story. He was a high school student at the lab school for Southern University in Baton Rouge, which was a crucible of student activism. And he talks about how he and his friend Hubert, this bespectacled, nerdy kid who was his classmate at the lab school, the famous march of students, they avoided it so they could go play basketball, which is doubly ironic, not only because of what Dennis went on to become, but because Hubert became H.Rap Brown, the most premier or prominent Black revolutionaries in the late 1960s. I then followed Dennis. I followed Dennis he then enrolled at Dillard College in New Orleans, where he got involved in the local chapter of CORE, chiefly in his account in hopes of getting a date with Doris Castle. With her sister Aretha, an important leader of the CORE chapter in New Orleans, and a woman he had a serious crush with her. Here you see her mugshot after she was arrested during the Freedom Rides. And there you also see her relaxing one evening with James Baldwin, who was very close to the people in the New Orleans CORE chapter. In fact, she was handing out flyers to participate in a sit-in. And so he took the flyer and went to the sit-in hoping to get a date, and that was his first arrest. This is another picture. That's a glorious picture of Doris Castle and James Baldwin. I don't have a lot of time to talk about the Freedom Rides. As I'm sure you know, they began as an attempt to test federal court decisions, which had ruled that segregation in interstate commerce, which is to say in interstate buses, was illegal. The CORE volunteers, the so-called Freedom Riders, who attempted to demonstrate that right, suffered a series of vicious attacks in Anniston, Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama, later Montgomery, Alabama, in which in one case their buses were burned. In each of those cities, they were greeted by Klansmen with no police in sight and beaten with pipes. This is a very famous photo of two of the Freedom Riders after one of the attacks. You'll recognize John Lewis, the congressman, and that's Jim Zwerg to his right. When civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King joined the Kennedy administration in calling for a cooling off period, urging the Freedom Riders to stop the Freedom Rides, students refused. In fact, students from all over the South who had already become involved in the movement through the sit-ins from Nashville and other places poured in determined to carry on and ride the buses from Alabama into the even more daunting territory of Mississippi, which gets to the next excerpt that I'm going to try to read. When I asked Dennis about how he got involved in the Freedom Rides, he characteristically offered a self-deprecating, slightly comic account. While others in the New Orleans chapter of CORE, Aaron and Smith, Doris and Aretha Castle, decided immediately to go, he declined. They pressed him. I must admit that I was not a volunteer, he's told me, but they began to buy drinks from me. And one thing after another, next thing I knew, I was on a train and getting off in Montgomery, Alabama in a little stupor of drunkenness. On entering the station, the first thing he saw was a bunch of white people. So I ran back on the train. His friends retrieved him, explaining that the white people were not Klansmen, but federal marshals, belatedly sent by the Kennedy administration. The group proceeded to Montgomery's First Baptist Church, where a mass meeting was being held, a meeting surrounded by a violent mob of white people, over 1,000 strong. When discussing the meeting in First Baptist Church, Dennis's voice changed. The people in the church, there you actually see the mob and the belated arrival of National Guardsmen. That's a scene from inside the church. The people in the church talked, prayed, and sang all night, even as the mob outside launched stones and tear gas canisters into the sanctuary. We got into this discussion about commitment and life and death and whether we should give our lives, Dennis remembered. Everybody knew this was a suicide mission. Elders, including Martin Luther King, begged the riders to stand down. Younger people, including Dennis's friends in Corps, declared their intention to continue and told King he should join them. He declined, citing a recent traffic arrest for which he was still on probation. But Julia Ahrens of the New Orleans Corps chapter was having none of it. I said to Dr. King, "I'm on probation too," she later recalled. He probably wanted to say, "You keep your mouth shut," but he didn't. On the contrary, King credited Ahrens with buoying his faith in the movement's inevitable success. When she boarded the bus a few hours later, he kissed her on the cheek and whispered, "Don't ever give up your beliefs for anybody." He did not, however, get on the bus. As the debate continued, Dennis remained irresolute. I was still having strong doubts, questioning why I was there, when I should be concerned with finishing school. At that moment, someone, he never knew who, made a statement that irrevocably changed his life. Quote, "Amongst all the confusion, someone in the meeting stood and said, 'There is no space in this room for both God and fear.' Right there, I made the choice to be on the first bus, and I never turned back." This is a photo taken by life photographer Bill Epprich of Dennis and Julia Ahrens on the Freedom Bus, the first bus out of Montgomery. I love this photo, right? Most of the photos of the civil rights era are statements. They instruct us on how we should feel. I love this one because it's an interrogatory. It's a raised eyebrow, sort of asking, how did we possibly get here? I'll just continue and then stop. Given the intensity of the preparation, the journey to Jackson proved anticlimactic. Unbeknownst to the riders, the Kennedy administration, desperate to avoid another public relations debacle, had cut a deal with Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett. The federal government would permit the arrest of the Freedom Riders so long as it was done without beating them. The deal held. Arriving at the terminal in Jackson, the riders were escorted through the waiting area to waiting paddy wagons, which carried them to jail. In fact, most of them ended up spending some 40 days in Mississippi's Parchman Farm. The unexpected reception was too much for some of the riders, who had all prepared themselves to die. A few freaked out, Dennis remembered. One rider just started beating his head against the wall, saying, "I'm dead, I'm dead." Another pulled out clumps of her own hair. Reflecting on his subsequent experiences in Mississippi, he added, "I had that same type of feeling, from day to day." Thank you. I'm going to, I think,
Wow, thank you.
share, and then
That we are back
We're
in
back.
the Zoom room. Thank you. That was extraordinary. As it's our custom, we will take questions from the room and then the Zoom room. And I'm just going to interrupt and take prerogative question. Fascinating that the editor of the New York Times was from Mississippi at that
I can't make it
time.
up.
Was he in place when New York Times versus Sullivan was litigated in 1964?
Yes.
Blowing. Okay, if you could explain that case for folks in the room who may not know, that was an extraordinarily landmark First Amendment case that comes out of this as well. And I hadn't fully appreciated that history. I will integrate this into my class going forward. Thank you for this paper. And that had been my first question.
Well, basically, it was a case, it involved Alabama. And what basically the state of Alabama tried to do was to bring charges against New York Times reporters that essentially made it impossible for them to report on civil rights. And so it became a crucial First Amendment case. It'd be interesting. It's interesting to wonder what would happen if a case like that came up, today.
And in other news, a daughter of the South became the Supreme Court Associate Justice as we were in talk. So these lives lost have led to someone being able to go to integrated schools and achieve and now sit on the bench. So thank you for this. I will turn it over to questions from the actual Zoom room or the room. Thank you, Jim. Okay, I have a Zoom room question from Charnel. who's another one of our fellows. Welcome, Charnel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for really provocative presentation. I really enjoyed the narratives and the visuals worked really well. And so you're kind of explaining how you've been collecting this, really rich archive of stories from all of these folks and kind of also incorporating it with unusual texts and things that people might not be putting together. So I'm wondering from your perspective, after all this time you've done kind of collecting these stories and, talking with people and being in the data and the archive, like what kind of silences do you think there are, or are there silences in the archive, or what maybe has been lost that can't be recovered? Or do you feel like it's kind of all there to piece together?
No, I mean, I think, it's, different people, there are different vehicles for taking what we carry in our heads and hearts and producing it in forms and storing it in forms that it will be accessible to other people. And so there's always an infinitude of stuff that's being lost, right? And one of the things that's quite interesting to me about the whole problem of collective memory, I mentioned this in the conversation with fellows the other day, when that term was first coined by a scholar named Maurice Halbach almost a century ago, he wasn't using collective memory just to say, this aggregation of what we all believe together. He was talking about the ways in which the societies in which you live create the structures which dictate or determine what it is we find memorable in the first place, right? And so, even if there weren't silences or suppressions or differences in terms of whose experiences are valued and what, experiences people write newspaper articles about or who they seek out to interview for their oral history project, the fact of the matter is the vast infinitude of human experiences being lost all the time. A lot of it that's happening to us, we are not even registering ourselves, much less recording. So, I mean, that's a kind of more philosophical response to your question, right? But I think that's part of what I am intrigued by, is trying to see if I can find some of those stories, right? I mean, I mentioned, I'll give you an example, and then I'll really try to give you a better, more sensible answer to your question. But just one other story that I was dying to tell, and I didn't have time. That woman I showed you, McDonald, told me the story. So the church gets burned on a night Klansmen are having a meeting a few miles away. And they know that Mickey Schwerner, who's the person they're determined to execute, has been meeting with people in that church. And so they're onto this, and they're trying to find him. And the Klan has already voted an order for an elimination order on it. Anyway, one of the people, a local policeman, in fact, comes into the Klan meeting and he says, there's a meeting over at the church. They have guards outside. Those guys must be there. And so they drive to the church, and there's not a meeting. There's a board of stewards meeting. There's no guards. And so it's basically stewards. They say, where's the white people? They say, what are you talking about? A few of them are assaulted. The church gets burned. But what Jewel told me, and she hadn't connected this, right, is that her mom was on the board of stewards. And so every night on Thursdays, you went into the church. They didn't have a collection. They collected during the week, and then the stewards came and gave their collections on Thursday night. And she said, we were having dinner. And my mom said, oh my God, I forgot. We have a meeting. And her brother, who just happened to be in town visiting, said, well, I'll take you, and jumped in the car and drove her out to the church. And because he wasn't a steward, he stood outside the door smoking a cigarette, waiting for the meeting. And that's clearly what the police officer saw. There's a person standing outside the church holding a cigarette. Inferred from this that there were guards, that there was a meeting, and so much else follows, And I'm not suggesting there that somehow, if only, he had put out the cigarette, all history would change, But it is a kind of wonderful way of thinking about the kind of, again, infinitude of things that come together to produce historical outcomes. So that's part of it. The other things in terms of kind of more conventional answering your question about what the archive lacks, I think the main thing about the Mississippi movement was not a Martin Luther King centered movement. It was not a movement of charismatic leaders. It was not a movement of demonstrations in public spaces while cameras followed. It was ordinary people. It was people like Dave Dennis's grandmother. It was people, he lived with a woman who ran a brothel when he was doing organizing in Mississippi. And when white people came to get him, she went to the door with a shotgun. And she said, "You're not taking him. And I also know each of you guys." And, and I think that's the part of the movement that I think people who work on Mississippi understand that full well. I think in terms of the kind of national imaginary about civil rights, we don't know that story very well.
So in the regular room, my associate director for faculty is fielding questions if there are any there. Jeremy Rosen, thank you for that.
While we're exercising prerogatives, I'll take. Thanks so much for this, Jim. I mean, it is such a fascinating wealth of stories that you've accumulated over this. And I guess I'm kind of curious about the relation between sort of the spectacular and the quotidian in this project, because it's obvious that part of your impetus is to sort of take all the stuff that sort of surrounds this spectacular episode. And I guess it's also making me think of kind of broader conversations we're having in this country about sort of structural or institutional racism versus what we might call a spectacular incident of it. And, I think a lot of the emphasis in that conversation is to talk about how normalized racism is and how there are subtle forms of violence that are quotidian and everyday and perhaps less dramatic and less obviously terrible, but kind of more pervasive and insidious for that. And so I guess I'm wondering if this yoking of these larger narratives to the spectacular incident is kind of paralleled by a kind of analytic framework that wants to sort of broaden our understanding of American racism sort of away from the spectacular and into the kind of institutional or structural.
Thank you. That's a really great question, and one I haven't really thought about. I mean, part of it I've thought about. Yeah, I mean, you're right that I love the fact that these events that qualify as history, these dramatic things that find their way into our history books, are happening at the same time that somebody's sitting over there having pastrami sandwich, right? And and that's of course a lot of writers, fiction writers, do that same sorts of thing. And so that's part of what I'm trying to get at. And I'm also trying to, in a sense, get at the ways in which historical events themselves are not only constellations of this infinitude of things that have come together, but then like pebbles in a pond, they ripple outward in ways that shape other people's lives, and collide with the ripples of other events and produce this kind of, I've been trying to work this metaphor and I still haven't, but like raindrops on a pond, this kind of infinite, ever-changing array of event and consequence and collision. And that's sort of, something I think about a lot. I think you're absolutely right that one, in effect, can do the same thing about the way in which racism works, right? The kind of horrible everydayness of it. And as you mentioned this, these stories are springing to my mind, but I also have to try to find, I'll give you two. So one of the people, she's dead now too, that I interviewed was a woman named Anita Blackwell, lived up in the Delta. And she is like the epitome of what the civil rights movement in Mississippi was. She was a sharecropper in Myersville, Mississippi, a mile or two from the Mississippi River, in the Delta with an 8th grade education when the first SNCC workers arrived. And it's funny, she told me this story. And she told me it with Stokely Carmichael. And I then told my friend Charlie Cobb about this story, and Charlie goes, wait, that was me. Charlie had just been canvassing with another field worker, and they decided to go canvass in Rolling Fork, Mississippi, because that's where Muddy Waters was from, and they thought that would be cool. It was a really bad idea. And of course, they had like knocked on one door by the time somebody called in the authorities, and a pickup truck came, window went down, shotgun came out and said, you have 1 minute to be out of town. So they got in their car and they drove, and they, trying to find some road, hoping it wasn't going to be a dead end into a plantation. And they ended up in this little county store, and they needed to call in. So they walked up to the county store, and Unita Blackwell was sitting on the porch. And they asked her if they had a phone, and she had had no experience of the civil rights movement at this point. And as she told the story, she said, yeah, there's one inside. She said, but don't use it, it's a party line. You should go talk to Mr. Silas and send him somewhere else, right? And that became the beginning of the movement in Myersville, Mississippi. And she finished high school. She was a delegate for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in Atlantic City in 1964. She got a college degree. She got a master's degree in planning. She became mayor of her town. She became head of the National Association of Black Mayors. She earned a MacArthur Genius Grant. She was part of the negotiations of President Carter during the normalization of relations with the People's Republic of China. Stone that the builders rejected, I made my cornerstone. She was hilarious too. She told me about riding on Air Force One. This was during the George W. Bush years. She goes, oh man, that plane was so sweet. She goes, I hear the one they got now is even better, but we got to vote that boy out of office because he's never going to take me for a ride. But she told the story one day, and she just sort of told it about driving on Highway 49 and getting pulled over by a couple of cops. And they made her get out of the car. And they made her take off her pants and her underpants, the side of the road. And one cop looked at the other and said, you want some of that? And the other cop looked at her and said, nah. And they drove away. And yeah, and she said, you believe that? You believe it, right? And again, that's an example of this. One other quick one that I heard from Jewel McDonald's husband. When I was taking these photos for the Florence Mars book and showing them and saying, do you know these people? And again, amazing how many people do know each other. I showed him one of a guy named Lee Kirkley, so that was his great uncle. And he told me a bunch of stories about Lee Kirkland. I wish I'd pulled up that photo. But he had a weird neurological condition that if you tickled him, or if you made sounds like things like that, he would spasm, which made him a figure of sport sometimes for local white people. But there were also, again, the etiquette of rural race relations is very complicated. Rural white people who liked him and appreciated him. The A&P grocer let him pick up all the expired fruit to take home and feed his family and his hog. So it's a weird thing. Anyway, he said one day, Lee Kirkland was an A&P, and some young kids started messing with him. He said, because what would happen is he would spasm, he would grab you. He was a very strong man, and he couldn't release. He said it was terrifying. So they did this to him, and the person next to him in the aisle was a white woman. And he grabbed her, and he couldn't release her. And they kept making the sound. They were going, kiss her, and she was screaming. And somebody calls the police, and as he's telling me this story, you kind of know where this story is going, right? They said the policeman came and arrested the white boys. On another occasion, this could have been completely different. So yeah, I think that that's exactly right. The kind of, again, the kind of quotidian violence And even it frames then even those moments of intimacy and fellowship, that those things can and do turn on a dime. I can't see, Erica, are there any more on the chat?
None that I see. People are coming on and off camera, but I'm not sure if that signified questions. So we are back to the room.
We can also have our lunch, so don't feel it. We're good.
Okay, I see you, Emily.
Yeah. My question is on the same theme as Jeremy's. So I'm sure you know that Lee Atwater video, you know. So I'm referring to this Southern strategy that Lee Atwater described, where he said, first you say N-word, 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 but then in 1954, but then later you can't say that. You can't say N-word, it backfires. So then you say states' rights and forced busing. Then you can't say that. And so you start talking, what made me think this was you showing Reagan up there, right? So then you start saying, he did say welfare queen, which was pretty obvious dog whistle, but then you say stuff like states' rights. And then you have to get even more abstract. It says you got to say cutting taxes and, you know, and but nevertheless, somehow the code gets transmitted to the right population. And I guess my question is about how, like, you've got these beautiful pictures and these atrocities and these remarkable stories of people being pulled over by cops and forced to strip and all this kind of stuff. And I guess my question is, what do we do when we can't work with those kinds of spectacular stories and visuals anymore because we've gotten so abstract in the way that Atwater talks about. So then you have people interviewing Ketanji Brown Jackson and asking her why she's not prosecuting pedophiles, right? Which is much harder to, you know, okay.
Thank you, that's great. I mean, I think a couple of this relates, at least connects in my mind to Tornell's question as well, because, you know, part of so when I started this, you know, and it's funny, I had ideas of what I was writing a book about, and it's still kind of my elevator pitch. And the more I write, I realize how inadequate that is, or that I'm ending up writing something rather different. But one of the things I really thought about was, and I said this to the fellows, I got very interested in and very frustrated by the paroxysm of hosannas that attended the passing of the World War II generation, the so-called greatest generation, to use Tom Brokaw's language. And it was a conversation I had a lot with my uncle. My uncle was actually on a Tom Brokaw, one of his specials in one of the stories. And my uncle's line on this, and I should publish, be the last thing I ever do, but publish an article like, he said, greatest generation, my ass, right? Some people were great people, other people were jerks. None of us wanted to be there. And, but particularly there was a moment, this is, some of you will remember this, in 1995 at the Smithsonian Museum of Air and Space, they decided they were going to do an exhibit on the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. They have the plane. So on the 50th anniversary, they were going to do this. But one of the things that they did was they collaborated with the museum in Hiroshima. And one of the exhibits, two exhibits, one was a wristwatch that was frozen at the exact moment the bomb detonated. And the other was the lunchbox of a child who was incinerated. And those were going to be included. And word of this got out to veterans groups, and from them out to members of the Republican Party. Shitstorm followed. The director of the Smithsonian was forced to resign. The exhibition never happened because, well, initially the veterans demanded that if the lunchbox was included, you also had to have an exhibit about Japanese atrocities against Allied prisoners. And because somehow you're introducing the honor of the greatest generation. And it occurred to me as all this was happening, and I'm going around the mountain to answer your question, I apologize. But it occurred to me as all this was happening that, this was our version of George Washington and the cherry tree. And this was our version of the memorialization of the Civil War and all the kind of horrible stuff that happened, And then those monuments for the Civil War, George Washington and the cherry tree, that doesn't happen in the immediate aftermath of events. It happens a generation later as the people who lived the experience are passing away, as we become responsible to remembering for the dead. And it occurred to me that the civil rights movement was next in the queue. It was the next story we had to tell ourselves about what our country was. And I thought I already knew what that story was going to look like, right? And it was going to be Martin Luther King, 40 feet tall on the Mall in Washington, Moses like raising his rod, the Red Sea parts. He had a dream, we all have a dream, and now he has a holiday. And isn't this great that we put all this behind us? And I hated that. And the people I work with who are student activists hated that, because the movement that the world the Mississippi Freedom Movement sought to instantiate was not the movement that happened. And in some sense, though they did defeat the kind of virulent forms of white supremacy that were characterized by Mississippi Jim Crow, the society that emerged looked more like what they aspired to than what the people who I'm interviewing aspired to. And again, it's related to the ways in which the kind of Southern strategy unfolded. Mississippi had 2 senators at the time, and both were plantation owners. James Eastland, was this fulminating red meat, N-word saying demagogue. James Eastland was defeated, but the other senator, John Stennis, who was much more buttoned down, wasn't. And one of the things Stennis did was there was a group in the late 60s. There was a group of progressives within the House of Representatives who were always aggrieved by the fact that civil rights legislation and forced desegregation was only being applied to the South. That there was segregation in the North too, and that there should be policies to integrate schools and other institutions in northern cities as well, even though it wasn't de jure in quite the same way. And nobody paid much attention. Peter Rodino, some of you remember from the Watergate era, was one of those people. John Stennis was like, you guys are right. Not because he believes in integration, but because he believes that once white Northerners are faced with the prospect that their kids are going to start integrating schools, that it will promote this back. So you're absolutely right. It comes to it moves from being a Democratic Party politics to a Republican Party politics, but it's a kind of dog whistle politics. And so when I started this book, that's what I thought I was fighting against, right? I thought, what I need people to understand is that the colorblind racism problem, right? That the struggle's not over, that in fact, a great deal of work was not accomplished or has subsequently been rolled back. We can't tell these, stories that Americans love to tell about, oh, it used to be so bad, but look how we've, this propensity that Americans have to use stories of Black exclusion and struggle to vindicate the essential rectitude of American institutions. So that's what I thought I was intervening against. What I didn't realize was that it was way worse than I thought. That in fact, a lot of people no longer feel compelled to speak in dog whistles. The fact that the President of the United States will not condemn, in some ways even commend, white supremacists and Klansmen who are killing a woman in Charlottesville, Virginia, right? And the fact in particular, and these 3 died because they were trying to work on a campaign to get Black people to be able to register to vote. And that we'd be living in a country now where state after state after state is deliberately adopting policies to make it more difficult. So, I thought I was going to have to write this book that would tell us that we shouldn't get complacent, that there was still work to do. And, that's kind of moved right on. And I don't quite know. I mean, it's really unsettled the book. And so I don't know how to bring that in, the fact that these people died because they're trying to register people to vote. And now there are 30 states that are considering or have passed legislation to make it more difficult. And in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the middle of a pandemic, a Republican legislator reduced the total number of polling places to 5, so that people, and particularly Black people, would have to wait 8 or 10 hours to vote. But in the state of Georgia, it is literally illegal to provide a glass of water to a person waiting in a voting line. This I didn't understand.
Well,
So,
you have a question on Zoom, but my suggestion is that you draw those connections, and you might also discuss how it's becoming more difficult to teach particular histories. I think this is such a rich project. So we are joined by one of your colleagues from Stanford. Emily Greenfield is here in the Zoom room and has been patiently waiting for her question to be posed. Thank you and welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Erica. I'm happy to be with you. And hi, Jim from California. It's nice to see you. So as I often do in talking to you about this project, I thought I would ask you a question of process, somewhat selfishly, because I work on memory as well. And by the way, I should say it's really powerful, as others have said in the chat, to see this, literally see this history, right? To see these images against your text. I think there's a lot to think about there. So my question is about truth. This is one of the things that historians think they are supposed to do, right? Go find a truth and write about it. And it strikes me that one of the kind of brilliant and powerful things about this project is that it is a meditation on both individual and collective memory, right? All of the things that people remember and forget. So what do you do with the concept of truth in this book? I mean, how important is it? Are you writing about something different? Do you have to chase a truth? Or is this really more about watching the ways people remember and forget?
that's a great question. And we had in the fellows meeting earlier this week, a similar question came up. And so this is my answer to this will kind of overlap, I think. My pretense during a lot of when people ask me what I was writing about, again, I haven't been writing for 20 years, let me say. I've been writing for about 1.5 years, but I've been visiting Mississippi and thinking about this off and on for 20 years. And when people ask me about it, and it happens a lot where this person tells you a story and that person tells you a story, and they have different versions, or where the same person tells you a story multiple times, but it changes with retellings. And I've delighted in that, right? And that one particular case, very pivotal moment in organizing in the Delta, 2 guys had told me different versions of it. Very visual versions, right? Vivid, that were contradictory. And so I actually got the 2 of them together. And I said, all right, you guys talk, and I'm just going to sit here, right? And watch them work this out. Sometimes you can disprove things, or sometimes a person will tell you something that cannot be the case. Sometimes these are consequences of trauma, as well as just the normal processes in which memory is shifting. The metaphors with which we think of memory is this kind of vault. It's just not like that, right? We are reassembling constantly. So, I debate when somebody tells me something that I believe is untrue, that I know is not true. Do I say anything? Do I just, be the objective observer and write that down? Or do I say, wait a minute, you told me the story earlier differently, or so-and-so's version, what do you think? And so what I've told people, again, my pretense was, I don't really care what happened, right? In fact, usually as a historian, you're kind of tearing your hair out because the evidence never aligns in the way that we wish it would. And so you're constantly trying to judge and think critically and piece together what really happened from often competing sources. And I've said, the joy of this project is I don't have to do that, right? When 3 people tell me 3 different versions, that's like grist for my mill. I couldn't be happier, blah, blah, blah. I have realized that I'm lying. right, then I'm lying to myself, you know, that in fact, what makes those, I don't want to call them, I don't know what to call them, I don't want to sound pejorative. It makes these misrememberings compelling, interesting, analytically rich, is precisely because we're interested in the ways and seeking to explain the ways in which they diverge from what actually happened, even as we acknowledge that we never fully can grasp what actually happened. And it's become really acute in the thing that I'm doing right now. So I have this, the beginning of this chapter, I think I said this to the fellows, so forgive me. I have a chapter that begins, in the beginning was the deed, which is the first line. You know, the joys of things that are really old is you can rip them off without having to worry about quotations. That's the beginning, the opening line of Goethe's Faust, right? And the point, and that's the sort of point. An event happened. 3 people were murdered, and all the other stories, all the tellings and retellings and the movies, the word is not the beginning. The word follows the deed. And so I said, I've been working on writing this chapter about the murders. And I don't know what happened. There are endless representations of it. There's the Norman Rockwell painting. There are all kinds of eyewitness accounts that I know, in fact, the people who are saying them weren't there. There's the movies. There were 4 people in the murder party who, over the course of 40 years, were turned by the FBI and gave proffers, each giving their account. But it's literally Rorschach, right? It's 4 people describing 4 versions of a crime that are all different and can't be reconciled. And the piece I'm writing right now is about the autopsy, which can resolve the fundamental question of whether James Chaney, the Black person, was beaten as opposed to merely shot. And I can't even answer that question. There have to this time been 4 post-mortem reviews. 2 competing ones at the time, 2 subsequent when the case was reopened in the early 2000s. And they all say something different. And so, you know, when we talked about this the other day, or, you know, with the fellows, I don't think of myself as a postmodernist. I really do believe that, you know, certain historical accounts are more accurate. As I said, you know, we give some people A's on their papers and some people B's on their papers, right? And yet, you know, it's a kind of crisis of faith when you realize the extent to which the actuality is utterly inaccessible to us. So, thank you.
All right, well, we
Getting out of time, are we?
we are technically at time. I can't see the room. If there is anyone who has a concluding question or comment, well, then if not, I will conclude by thanking you so much for this interesting and important work and for being a member of our community. We've made it happen post-pandemic. Jim was actually supposed to be joining us earlier, and he's here now, and it's just been so wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for all you do.
All right.